The human ship crossed the threshold line at Border Station Vale without filing a single form, and that was the moment the galaxy began to die. You should understand what the threshold line was before you understand what was broken. It was not a wall. It was a law made of light, drawn across the only safe road into the inner stars, and for 9,000 years, nothing had crossed it without permission. Permission was a number. The number was issued by the registry. The registry was everything. Tolian Breck was the chronicler on duty that shift, and he was not a soldier. He was not even an officer. He counted things. He wrote down what crossed the line and what it carried, and he had done this for 41 years, and in all that time, the most exciting thing he had ever recorded was a grain hauler that arrived 11 minutes early. He had written a long, careful report about it. Nobody read the report. That was fine. The report existed. That was the point. You may not know what a chronicler was in the registry, and so you will not understand at first why everything turned on one. A chronicler was the lowest of the clerks. He did not issue numbers. He did not revoke them. He did not decide who could trade or breathe or pass. He only recorded, in two columns, the official column that the ledger read, and the private column that nobody read, and the private column existed for a single ancient reason, written into the founding rules so long ago that no one remembered the meaning of it. The reason was this: if the ledger was ever wrong, someone had to have written down that it was wrong. The registry, in its first and only moment of humility, 9,000 years dead, had built itself one honest witness, and then forgotten he was there. Tolian had filled 411 private columns in his life, and not one of them had ever contradicted the ledger, because the ledger had never been wrong, because the ledger was the world, and the world could not disagree with itself. He had begun, late in his life, to suspect that the private column was a kind of joke played on him by the architecture of his own civilization, a place to write things that would never matter, a courtesy extended to a man who counted grain. He kept filling it anyway. It was his trade. A man keeps his trade. He was old, by the measure of his species, and he had made his peace with a small life. He had a narrow bunk on the inner ring, and a window the size of his hand, and through it, he could see the threshold line glowing in the dark, and he had watched that line for so long that he had stopped seeing it as a wonder and started seeing it as furniture. He did not expect anything to ever come through it that he had not already seen 10,000 times. That was the great mercy and the great poverty of his life, and he did not know which it was, and he had stopped asking. So when the unknown shape slid out of the dark with no beacon, no number, and no apology, Tolian did the only thing his entire life had prepared him to do. He reached for his stylus. The shape did not match any hull in the catalog. The catalog held 260,000 registered designs. Tolian had read all of them. He read them for pleasure, and this thing matched none of them, which meant, by the only logic Tolian had ever been given, that it did not exist. He logged it as an error. There was a key for that, on the chronicler's console, a single soft key worn smooth by 41 years of his own thumb, and pressing it told the ledger that what his eyes reported could not be true and should be set aside until the instruments corrected themselves. He had pressed it perhaps 30 times in his career, always for a sensor ghost, always for a flaw in the optics, and always the ghost had resolved into nothing, because that was what ghosts did. He pressed it now. He waited for the gray shape to resolve into nothing. It did not resolve into nothing. It got, very slightly, closer. That is the first thing you must know. The first human ship the registry ever saw. It filed as a typo, and the typo did not have the decency to disappear. And a typo that will not disappear is the beginning of a question, and the registry had spent 9,000 years making sure no one ever asked one. The station around him was vast and pale and quiet, a ring 300 kilometers wide, staffed by clerks of 40 species, all of them sorting, stamping, indexing, cross-referencing. Border Station Vale did not have weapons. It had never needed weapons. It had something stronger than weapons. It had the ledger, and the ledger decided whether a thing was allowed to be real. Think about what that meant, because the humans thought about it for a very long time before they ever came. A station with no guns is not a weak station. In a galaxy where every gun in existence is registered, where every shell and every charge and every targeting system pings the central index before it fires, where a weapon that loses its number simply stops working, because it no longer believes it is allowed to. The registry had not disarmed itself. It had done something far more total. It had made violence itself a thing that required permission, and then it had kept the only stamp. Border Station Vale did not need guns because it lived at the center of a galaxy where nothing could shoot without the Ledger's blessing, and the Ledger blessed nothing that pointed inward. Tolian's supervisor was a Hesh named Quorum 9, a creature the size of a door, with a voice like a drawer closing. Quorum 9 drifted to Tolian's station because the error had pinged 3 departments at once, and 3 departments at once was, in the life of the station, a catastrophe. "You have logged an unregistered transit," Quorum 9 said. "Correct it." "I cannot correct it," Tolian said. "It is still there." They both looked at the screen. The shape sat just past the line, motionless, gray, longer than anything in the catalog and far thinner, like a blade that had decided to be patient. No markings the Ledger recognized, no transponder, no request for docking. It simply was, where nothing was allowed to simply be. Tolian found that he could not stop looking at the proportions of the thing. Every hull in the catalog had been designed under the Ledger, which meant every hull had been designed to be seen, to announce its class and its cargo and its origin at a glance, because a ship that could not be read at a glance could not be cleared, and a ship that could not be cleared could not move. Registry hulls were broad and bright and labeled. They wore their numbers like faces. This gray thing wore nothing. It had been built by someone who did not care whether it could be read, and Tolian had never in his life seen an object made by a mind that did not care whether it could be read, and the sight of it made something turn over slowly in his chest, a feeling he did not have a word for, because the registry did not issue words for feelings that did not appear in the Ledger. He would learn the word later, from the humans. The word was dread. Quorum 9 did the proper thing. Quorum 9 opened a channel and issued the standard hail, the one that had turned back 10,000 vessels over the centuries without a shot, because the registry had never needed shots. "Unregistered object," the Hesh said. "You have crossed the threshold line without issuance. You are not permitted. You do not have a number. Withdraw. File in the proper sequence, and you may be considered. This is your only notice." There was a pause. Tolian would remember the length of that pause for the rest of his life. It was 4 seconds. He counted. He counted everything. Then the unknown ship answered, in flawless registry tongue, in a voice that was calm and almost gentle, the way you are gentle with something small. "We don't have a number," the voice said. "We have a name. We're the quiet margin, out of Earth. We're not asking to enter. We're already in." Tolian had heard a great many vessels answer that hail across 41 years. They answered in fear, or in pride, or in the practiced patience of a trader who has done this 1,000 times. He had never once heard a vessel answer the way the quiet margin answered, which was the way you correct a misunderstanding so small that it is almost not worth correcting. The human did not sound defiant. Defiance is a thing you feel toward a power you fear. The human sounded the way Tolian himself sounded when he told a junior clerk that the form they were holding was the wrong form. Helpful. Slightly amused. Entirely unconcerned. Quorum 9 consulted the Ledger. Earth was not in the Ledger. Earth had no entry, no classification, no trade rating, no threat assessment, no anything. A place with no entry could not send a ship, because a ship required an origin, and an origin required a record, and a record required a number. The whole chain failed at the first link. Tolian watched the Hesh process this, and he understood, in the way a man understands a thing about his lifelong colleague, exactly what was happening behind the supervisor's flat, dark eyes. Quorum 9 was not afraid. Quorum 9 was relieved. The contact had no entry, and a contact with no entry was not a threat, because a threat was a category in the Ledger, and an unlisted thing could not be sorted into any category at all. To the Hesh, an unlisted thing was less alarming than a late grain hauler, because the grain hauler at least existed and could therefore be wrong. The gray ship could not be wrong. It could only be absent, and you do not fear an absence. You file it and move on. This was the precise shape of the error that killed 9,000 years of peace. The registry had built itself so completely around the list that it had lost the ability to be afraid of anything the list could not hold. Its perfect security, was its perfect blindness. Tolian saw it on the supervisor's face, the deep calm of a creature looking directly at its own death and feeling nothing but the small satisfaction of a closed file. So Quorum 9, who was a being of perfect procedure, reached the only conclusion procedure allowed. "You are not real," the Hesh said. "You are an unfiled fiction. You will be expunged from the active record. Good shift." And Quorum 9 closed the channel, marked the contact as resolved, and drifted away to deal with a backlog of cargo manifests, fully believing the matter was finished, because in 9,000 years, the matter had always been finished the moment the ledger said so. Tolian did not drift away. Tolian was a chronicler. His job was not to decide what was real. His job was to write down what happened, and what was happening was that a thing the ledger had just declared imaginary had not gone anywhere. It sat past the line, gray and patient, and after a moment, a small light blinked on its hull, and Tolian's instruments told him the light was a scan. The quiet margin was reading the station, reading the ledger, reading every record the station held, gently, completely, the way Tolian read the catalog for pleasure. It did not alarm any of the station's defenses, because the station's defenses were built to stop the unlisted from entering, and the scan was not entering anything. It was only looking, and a being declared not to exist cannot trip an alarm, because there is no rule against an imaginary thing reading your most secret records, because no one in 9,000 years had ever imagined needing such a rule. He should have reported it. He reached for the stylus instead, and under the official log, in the small private column where chroniclers were permitted to note their own impressions, Tolian Breck wrote the first true sentence anyone in the galaxy wrote about humanity. "It is not waiting for our permission, it is taking our inventory." He looked at the sentence for a long moment after he wrote it. He did not fully understand it yet. But some part of him, the part that had counted things for 41 years, the part that knew the difference between a thing that is filed and a thing that is true, understood that he had just written the most important sentence of his life, and that no one would read it for a very long time, and that by the time they did, it would already be the only honest record left of how the world ended. He did not yet know what that meant. He would learn. The whole galaxy would learn, in order, the way you read a list, top to bottom, until you reach the part that ends you. For 2 hours, the quiet margin did nothing but read, and the station did nothing but pretend it wasn't there, and Tolian Breck did the one thing nobody else thought to do. He kept watching. The registry was not an empire of soldiers. You must hold this in your mind, because everything that follows depends on it. The registry was an empire of clerks. It ruled 4,000 worlds, and it had never fought a war, because it had never needed to. It did not destroy enemies. It unlisted them. A world that displeased the registry simply lost its number, and a world without a number could not trade, could not dock, could not buy air filters, or medicine, or seed, and within a generation, it starved itself quiet and begged to be re-entered. That was the whole weapon, the threat of erasure. 9,000 years of peace enforced by a filing system, and it had worked, because every species the registry ever met wanted to exist inside the ledger more than it wanted anything else. So the registry had no concept of a thing that did not want to be in the ledger at all. Consider how strange that made the humans, from where Tolian sat. Every species the registry had ever met had arrived at the threshold line the same way, hungry. They came begging for a number, because a number was access, and access was survival. The Skell had begged for a number. The Omat had begged for a number. The Hesh, in the deep past, had been the first to invent the begging, and had been rewarded with the keeping of the list itself. 9,000 years of arrivals, and every single one had wanted in, because the registry had made certain that wanting in was the only sane thing to want. The galaxy had been trained, the way you train a creature, to fear being outside. And then a gray ship had crossed the line and announced, in the calmest voice anyone had ever heard, that it had no number, wanted no number, and was not asking. It had not come to be let in. It had come because it had decided, on its own authority, with no permission from anyone, that it was already allowed to be anywhere it chose. Tolian did not have a word for that either then. He has one now. The word is sovereignty, and the registry had spent 9,000 years making sure no species under it ever learned that the word could apply to them. Tolian watched the human scan crawl across the station's archives. It was not stealing the records. That was the part that unsettled him. Theft he could have filed. Theft had a form. This was something else. The quiet margin was copying the ledger the way a student copies a textbook, learning it, and Tolian understood with a slow, cold drop in his gut that the humans were not breaking into the system. They were studying how it worked so they would know exactly which thread to pull. He watched the scan linger longest on the oldest records, the founding statutes, the rules so ancient that no clerk alive had read them in full because no situation had ever required it. The quiet margin read those most carefully of all. Tolian could see the scan slow as it passed over them, the way your own eye slows over the one line in a contract that changes everything. He did not know then which line the humans were reading. He would find out 9 days later, and the knowing would take his breath. For now he only saw a gray ship reading the small print of an empire that had stopped reading its own small print thousands of years before it was born. He sent a message up the chain. He marked it urgent. The chain sent it back stamped insufficient registry basis, which was the official way of saying the thing he was describing could not be happening because it had no entry. You cannot escalate a fiction. The form does not exist. Tolian read the rejection 3 times. He was not an angry man. 41 years of counting grain does not leave much room for anger. But he felt, reading those 3 words, the first true frustration of his life, because he understood that the system had just protected itself from the only warning that could have saved it. The registry could not hear about the humans, because the only language the registry could hear was the language of the list, and the humans had carefully, deliberately, refused to speak it. They had made themselves unhearable. Every alarm Tolian could raise would come back stamped the same way, forever, until the thing the alarm was about had finished happening. He looked at the gray ship on his screen, still reading, still patient, and he understood that the humans had not merely found a gap in the registry's defenses. They had found that the registry's entire nervous system, every sense it had, every way it had of knowing the world, ran through the list, and that a thing outside the list was not merely hidden from the registry. It was, to the registry, a hole in the universe that no instrument and no clerk and no law could be made to look at. The humans were not sneaking past the guard. They had discovered that the guard's eyes only worked on things wearing a number, and had simply taken theirs off. That was when Quorum 9 made the second mistake, and the second mistake is the one the galaxy never forgave itself for. The Hesh decided to make the unregistered object go away properly. Not with weapons. The station had none. With law. Quorum 9 invoked a sanction of non-existence, the highest instrument the registry possessed, a decree that ordered all 4,000 worlds, all ports, all stations, all ships, to treat a named thing as if it had never been. Air would not be sold to it. Routes would not open for it. No dock would receive it. Cut off from the ledger, it would die the way everything died, slowly, alphabetically. Quorum 9 drafted the sanction against the quiet margin and against the unfiled fiction called Earth, and broadcast it across the entire inner sphere with the full authority of the registry, and felt, Tolian could tell, a deep procedural satisfaction. The problem had a form now. The form had been filed. The matter was, once again, resolved. Tolian wanted to stop him. He stood, halfway, at his low desk, with some warning rising in his throat that he could not have put into words, even if anyone would have listened. He had read the human scan linger on the founding statutes. He did not know what it had found there, but he knew, with the deep, wordless certainty of a man who has spent his life around documents, that you do not hand a fresh decree to a reader who has just spent 2 hours studying the exact machinery of your decrees. You do not give a key to the one creature in the galaxy who has just memorized every lock. He opened his mouth. Quorum 9 had already pressed the seal. It was done. It is always done by the time the chronicler stands up. That is the nature of chroniclers, and the reason they are given a private column instead of a voice. The quiet margin received the sanction. Tolian saw the human ship's scanner pause, as if reading it. Then the calm voice came back over the open channel, and this time the whole station heard it, every clerk at every desk, because the humans had broadcast on the same authority-wide band the registry had just used. "Thank you," the human voice said. "We were hoping you'd put it in writing." Tolian did not understand. Not yet. He would, in about 90 seconds. "You've just told 4,000 worlds that we don't exist," the voice went on, still gentle, almost kind. "That means, by your own law, nothing we do can be on the record. We can't be tracked because we're not listed. We can't be blamed because we're not real. We can't be sanctioned twice because you can't unlist a thing that's already unlisted. You've spent 9,000 years building a cage, and you just locked us outside of it. Out here, your rules don't reach. Out here, we're the only thing that's allowed to act." A clerk 3 desks from Tolian, an Omet with translucent skin, made a small sound. The Omet had understood first. Tolian knew the Omet slightly. Her name was Sepha, and she sorted customs duties, and she had a child in the station creche, and she was, in that moment, the second being in the galaxy after Tolian himself, to comprehend what was about to happen to the registry. Her translucent skin had gone the color of cold water. She was looking at the sanction text, still scrolling on the shared board, the proud decree Quorum 9 had broadcast, and she had read in it what Tolian had read in it, which was a confession, signed by the entire registry, that the humans could not be touched. "You think you're showing us the door," the human said. "You've shown us we're already in the room, and you can't see us, because you erased the lamp." The quiet margin moved. It did not move the way warships in the catalog moved. Tolian had read the engagement records of the old border skirmishes, back when the registry still had rivals, before it had simply listed them out of history. Those ships lumbered, they announced. They postured. The quiet margin slid forward across the threshold line, with no acceleration flare at all, no warning, a single smooth motion, like a finger laid across a page, and crossed into registry space. And the law that had held for 9,000 years did not even click. Tolian thought, in that moment, about the word the human had used, margin. He had wondered at it from the first hail, because the registry had no ships named for such a thing. Registry ships were named for what they enforced. The indenture, the tribute, the compliance. They wore their purpose the way they wore their numbers, plainly, as a kind of threat. But a margin was the blank space at the edge of a page, the part outside the writing, the part where nothing was filed, the part a clerk left empty on purpose, so that a correction could be made later if the record ever proved wrong. The humans had named their ship for the one place on every document where the truth could still be written after the official text was set. They had named it for the private column. They had named it, Tolian realized with a slow, cold turn of understanding, for him, or for what he was, for the honest witness the registry kept at the edge of itself and never read. He did not believe in omens. He wrote it down anyway. Quorum 9 ordered the station's barrier field raised. The field was not a weapon either. It was a wall of denial, a projected zone that scrambled the navigation of any vessel without a valid number, because a vessel without a number could not be permitted to know where it was. 10,000 ships had been turned back at this very ring by that field, confused, blinded, sent home. The field came up. The quiet margin passed through it as if it were a rumor. Tolian's instruments told him why, and he wrote it down with a hand that had started, very slightly, to shake. The field worked by reading a ship's registry signature and corrupting its sense of position, but the quiet margin had no registry signature. The field reached for the number that told it what to scramble, found nothing, and did nothing. The humans had been declared non-existent, and so the wall built to stop existing things let them walk straight through. The registry had spent 9 millennia perfecting a defense against everything that was in the ledger, and the one ship in the galaxy that was not in the ledger had just been handed the keys by the very decree meant to destroy it. They sanctioned themselves a master key, the Omet clerk whispered. "We gave it to them. We gave it to them ourselves." Tolian wanted to tell her she was wrong. He could not. He had reached for the comfort that a chronicler reaches for, which is precedent, the long shelf of everything that had happened before, and he had found the shelf empty. There was no precedent. In 9,000 years of records, across 4,000 worlds, in 260,000 registered designs, and 10,000 turned-back vessels, and 100 starved rebel planets, there was not one entry, not one, of a thing the ledger had failed to hold. The humans were the first blank line in the history of the registry. And a chronicler knows that a blank line in a perfect record is not an absence. It is a door. Quorum 9 did not panic, because the HESH did not have a procedure for panic. The HESH had a procedure for unauthorized transit, and it executed that procedure flawlessly, summoning the only force the inner sphere kept for ceremony rather than war, the tribute wardens. 312 enforcement cutters, lightly armed, mostly decorative, kept on station to escort dignitaries and impress visiting traders. They had never fired in anger. They had never needed to. Their job was to be a number so large that no one ever made them prove it. 312 against 1. You should sit with that, because it is the heart of why the registry could not win. The tribute wardens were not a navy. They were a statistic. They existed to be counted, not to fight, and in 9,000 years, no one had ever made the distinction matter, because no one had ever been outside the list long enough to force the count to mean anything. A force that has never fought believes it is strong because it has never been weak. It has simply never been tested, and the humans, who tested everything, who had spent 2 patient hours reading the station precisely so they would understand exactly what they were facing, knew the tribute wardens for what they were, before the first cutter ever undocked. They knew them better than the wardens knew themselves. The wardens formed up. It was a beautiful thing to see, in its way, and Tolian recorded it without irony, because it was the last beautiful thing the registry's fleet would ever do. 312 cutters, polished for ceremony, lights running gold along their flanks, sliding into the parade formation that had impressed grain ministers and trade lords for 90 centuries. A wall of disciplined gleaming hulls closing on a single gray ship that had not so much as raised a shield. From the station it looked like a foregone conclusion. From the station it looked like an empire, calm and vast, swatting an insect. Tolian, watching, knew it was the opposite, and the knowing sat in him like a stone, because he could not make anyone else see it, and a chronicler who sees the ending before anyone else is the loneliest creature in the galaxy. You already know how this ends, but the wardens did not, and neither did Tolian truly, not yet, not in his body, and neither did the 4,000 worlds now reading a sanction that had just become the most dangerous document the registry had ever produced. So they all watched, the way you watch, as the quiet margin slowed in the middle of the assembling cutters, and did the thing that frightened Tolian more than any weapon ever could have. It opened a channel, and politely asked the tribute wardens to file their flight plans, so it could log the engagement correctly. "We like records," the human voice said. "We'd hate to get yours wrong." And then it began, and Tolian Breck, chronicler, counter of things, the one being on Border Station Vale whose entire purpose was to write down exactly what happened, picked up his stylus and got ready to do his job, because someone had to, and because he understood, before anyone else of authority did, that he was about to witness the only event in 9,000 years worth recording. The first warden cutter to close on the quiet margin was the Indenture, captained by a proud skell named Vire Tessum, who had spent her whole career escorting grain ministers and had never once imagined dying. She brought her cutter in along the textbook approach, the one taught at the academy, the one designed for a target that obeyed the ledger and slowed when ordered. The quiet margin did not slow. It did not fire either. Not at first. It simply was not where the Indenture's instruments said it would be, and then it was somewhere the Indenture's instruments could not explain, and Vire Tessum's gunners reported that their targeting systems kept returning the same impossible result. No lock, no reading. The system insisted there was nothing to fire at, because the thing they were trying to fire at had no entry, and a registry weapon, like everything else the registry built, would not engage what was not on the list. The humans had thought of this. The humans, Tolian would later realize, had thought of all of it, weeks before they ever crossed the line, sitting somewhere in the dark reading the sanction laws the registry published freely and proudly, the way a careful reader finds the single sentence in a contract that unmakes the whole thing. Vire Tessum did the thing a brave officer does when her instruments fail her, which is to trust her own eyes, and that was the bravest and most useless decision of her life. She ordered her gunners to fire on the visual track, the gray shape they could all see plainly through the viewport, and for the first time in 3,000 years, a registry crew aimed a weapon at something that was not a number on a board, but a thing in front of them, and it felt to them, Tolian imagined, like firing at a ghost, because their whole lives the ledger had told them what to shoot, and now the ledger said there was nothing there. The indenture fired anyway, blind, on visual, the way no registry ship had fired in 3,000 years. The shots went wide into empty dark, because the humans had given the station a false shape of themselves to scan, and were not, in fact, quite where the eye expected. And a gunner who has trusted instruments his whole career does not know how to lead a target by feel. The quiet margin answered with one shot. Tolian saw it. A single lance of directed force, narrow, precise, almost surgical, that crossed the gap between the two ships, in a time his instruments rounded to zero. It did not hit the indenture's hull. It hit the indenture's registry beacon, the small device that broadcast the cutter's number to the ledger, and it removed it. Cleanly, completely, and the indenture vanished from the station's tracking board as though it had never been issued. The humans had not destroyed the ship, not yet. They had unlisted it. They had used the registry's own ultimate weapon, erasure, and turned it into something a gun could do, and Viertessum found herself suddenly flying a vessel that no longer existed, in a space where only listed things were permitted to be, surrounded by a defense grid built to deny passage to exactly such a thing. The station's barrier field, still up, still reaching for unregistered objects to scramble, found the newly numberless indenture and did to it what it had been trying to do to the humans. It seized the cutter's navigation and folded it in half against the law of the place, and the indenture, captain and crew and all, was turned back at the border so violently that nothing came back across the line but a long, cold smear of debris and a tracking entry that read, "For 9,000 years of bitter irony, object never present." Tolian heard Viertessum in the last half-second, because the channel was still open, because the humans had left it open on purpose so that everyone would hear. She did not scream, she filed. In the final instant of her life, faced with a wall of denial closing on her ship, the proud Skell captain did the only thing 9,000 years had taught her brain to do, which was to broadcast an emergency request for reissuance of her vessel's number. A plea to the ledger to make her real again. Please, immediately. The ledger's automated voice answered her, clear and patient, in the half-second she had left. It informed her that a request for reissuance must be filed by a vessel present in the active record, and that her vessel was not present in the active record, and that her request was therefore denied, and that she should refile through the proper channel. There was no proper channel. There was no more Viertessum. The denial finished a fraction of a second after she did. Tolian wrote it down. His hand had stopped shaking. There is a kind of fear that goes so deep it becomes calm, and he had arrived there, and from inside that calm he understood the shape of the thing now, the whole terrible elegant shape of it, and he reached for the private column and wrote the second true sentence. They are not going to break our law. They are going to obey it harder than we can survive. Across the assembling wardens, the order came down to fire at will, all 311 remaining cutters at once. On visual, forget the ledger, just kill the gray thing in the middle. It was the right order. It was 9,000 years too late to have ever practiced it. And the quiet margin, alone in the center of the largest force the registry had ever assembled, opened its channel one more time, and the calm voice spoke to all of them at once, unhurried, almost warm, and said the sentence that Tolian Breck would carry to his grave. You really should have just let us fill out the form. 311 cutters fired at once, and Tolian Breck learned what humans meant by the word patience. The volley was beautiful, in the way an avalanche is beautiful. 11,000 individual weapon discharges, lighting the dark around the quiet margin into a brief false day, and for one full second, Tolian could not see the human ship at all inside the glare, and he allowed himself to believe, just for that second, that the ledger had been right, and the gray thing had been a fiction after all, and the universe had snapped back to the shape it was supposed to have. The glare faded. The quiet margin was still there. It had not raised a shield, because Tolian's instruments told him it did not have one in the way the registry understood shields. It had simply not been hit. Across an entire second of concentrated fire from 311 ships, not one shot had landed, and Tolian, who counted things, sat very still and tried to understand how a number that large could equal 0. He found the answer in the firing logs the cutters were dutifully broadcasting to the ledger, because registry ships logged everything, even their own deaths, even now. Every cutter had aimed at where the catalog said an unregistered object of that mass should be, with the lag the catalog said its engines should have. But the Quiet Margin's engines did not match the catalog, because the Quiet Margin was not in the catalog, and the humans had spent 2 hours at the threshold line, letting the station scan them precisely, so the station's predictions of where they would be would all be wrong in the same direction. They had fed the ledger a false shape of themselves, and then moved like their true shape, and 311 gunners had fired with perfect discipline at a ghost the humans had drawn for them. This is the part Tolian found hardest to write, because it was the part that revealed how long the humans had been thinking. The false shape was not improvised, it could not have been. To feed a defense grid, a self-portrait, precise enough that 311 independent gunnery systems would all miss in the same direction, you had to know, in advance, how that grid predicted motion, how it weighted mass against thrust, how it led a target across the dark. The humans had known. They had learned it in those 2 patient hours, yes, but they had come knowing what to look for, which meant they had studied the registry from outside, for a long time, from worlds that had no idea they were being studied. The galaxy had believed itself unobserved because nothing unobserved appeared in the ledger. The humans had simply watched from the one place the ledger could not see, which was everywhere outside it. Tolian set this down, and then sat very still, because a worse thought had arrived. If the humans had studied the registry this closely before they ever crossed the line, then nothing that was happening now was a battle. A battle is 2 forces discovering each other. This was a reading. The humans had finished discovering the registry weeks ago, alone, in the dark, and what was happening at Border Station Vale was not a fight at all. It was a demonstration of a conclusion already reached. They were not trying to win. They had already won, somewhere far away, in silence, and had come here only to show the galaxy the answer. They let us look, the Amit clerk breathed. Those 2 hours, they wanted us to think we'd measured them. There was a thing Tolian noticed then that he put in the private column and has never stopped thinking about. The humans had not hidden from the scan. A clever enemy hides. A cleverer enemy lets you scan a lie. But the cleverest enemy of all, the one the registry had never imagined, lets you scan the truth and trusts that you will not believe it, because the truth is outside your categories, and your instruments will round it to the nearest thing they can hold. The humans had shown the station exactly what they were, a thing with no number, a thing that did not obey the catalog, and the station had looked straight at it and filed it as an error, because that was the only drawer the truth would fit in. The deception had not been a false shape painted over a real one. The deception had been honesty, offered to a system that could not receive it. That was the most human thing of all, Tolian would come to believe. They did not trick you with a lie. They trusted you to lie to yourself, and you always did. She was holding the edge of her desk with both translucent hands. Tolian wanted to say something to her, some small clerk's comfort, and found he had none, because the thing she had just understood was the thing he had understood an hour before her, and there was no comfort in it, only the cold company of 2 people watching the same ending arrive. He had spent 41 years sitting near Cepha, and they had never once spoken of anything that mattered. They were speaking of it now. It was too late to matter, and it mattered more than anything either of them had ever said. Then the Quiet Margin began to answer, and it answered the way it had answered the indenture, 1 shot at a time, and 1 beacon at a time, and Tolian understood the worst part of the human plan, the part that turned his calm fear into something close to grief. They were not destroying the cutters. They were unlisting them, shot after shot, each one striking a registry beacon and nothing else, each one removing a warden cutter from the ledger and leaving it whole, intact, fully crewed, and suddenly non-existent inside a defense grid that hated non-existent things. And the station's own barrier field, the great wall of denial that had kept the inner sphere safe for 9 millennia, turned on its own fleet, and began to do to the wardens what it had been built to do to invaders. One by one, the numberless cutters lost their navigation, folded against the law of the place, and were turned back at a border their own empire had drawn, and the tracking board filled with the same cold entry, again and again, object never present, object never present, object never present. The humans had not brought a weapon big enough to kill 300 ships. They had brought a weapon precise enough to make the registry kill them for it. Tolian counted. 40 cutters gone in the first minute. Their captains screamed into the ledger as they died, demanding reissuance, demanding their numbers back, filing emergency requests for existence in the half-second before the field took them, and the registry's automated systems, faithful to the end, replied to each one with the standard message that a vessel must be present in the active record to file a request. And the vessels were not present in the active record because the humans had just removed them, and so the requests were denied, correctly, by the book, all the way down. It was the most lawful massacre in the history of the galaxy. Not one rule was broken. That was the horror of it. Tolian wrote that down too, and as he wrote it, he felt the full weight of what the humans had built, which was not a weapon at all in the way the catalog understood weapons. The catalog measured weapons by yield, by the energy they delivered, by the matter they could unmake. By that measure, the quiet margin was almost harmless. Its single lance could erase a beacon, and nothing more. It could not have cracked a colony dome. It could not have boiled a sea. A registered warship from the old skirmishes would have outgunned it 1,000 times over. But the humans had not built a weapon to fight the registry. They had built a weapon to fight the registry's mind, and the registry's mind was the list, and against the list, the smallest possible shot, precisely placed, was the most powerful weapon imaginable, because it did not destroy a ship. It revoked a ship's permission to exist, and then let 9,000 years of registry law do the killing for free. Every cutter the humans unlisted was executed, not by the quiet margin, but by the registry itself, by its own walls, its own decrees, its own faithful automated voice patiently denying reissuance to the dying. The humans had turned the empire into its own executioner and stood back to let it work. Tolian, who had spent his life believing that the worst thing that could happen to a being was to lose its number, watched 240 cutters lose their numbers in the time it took him to draw a breath, and understood that the humans had not invented this horror. The registry had. The humans had only, at last, shown the registry what it had always been. Quorum 9, watching the tracking board empty, did the thing that Hesh do when procedure fails, which is to escalate to a larger procedure. The supervisor invoked the final census, an instrument so old that no living clerk had ever seen it used, a total lockdown that froze the entire ledger across all 4,000 worlds, suspended all transit, all trade, all issuance, and concentrated the full denial authority of the registry into a single overwhelming pulse aimed at one target. The census did not blow things up. It declared them, with the combined certainty of an entire civilization, to be nothing. Whole rebel worlds in the deep past had been censused into starvation and surrender. It was the loudest word the registry could say, and it had never once been answered. Tolian watched the census assemble, and he wanted to scream at his supervisor not to do it, and he knew it would do no good, because he had finally understood the rule that governed everything the humans did, and the rule was this: the humans never struck first. They had not crossed the line and opened fire. They had crossed the line and waited. Every blow that fell because the registry threw it, and every blow the registry threw, the humans turned, because they were the one thing in the galaxy outside the system that aimed all those blows. The final census was the largest blow the registry had, and Tolian understood, with perfect clarity and perfect helplessness, that the largest blow turned against you is the largest harm of all. The pulse hit the quiet margin. 4,000 worlds, in a single coordinated instant, declared the human ship to be nothing. The quiet margin already agreed. Tolian saw it on his instruments, the most elegant and terrible thing he would ever see. The census reached for the human ship's place in the ledger to scrub it out, and found that the humans had never had a place in the ledger to begin with, had refused one from the first hail, had announced themselves with a name instead of a number, precisely so that this moment, when it came, would find nothing to delete. The most powerful weapon the registry possessed passed through the quiet margin like the barrier field had, like the targeting locks had, like every instrument of an empire built entirely to control things that wanted to exist inside it, and reached, with all 4,000 worlds behind it, the only registered things left in the area. Its own fleet. The final census, aimed at the one ship it could not touch, landed instead on the 271 cutters that still had their numbers, and declared them, with absolute civilizational certainty, to be nothing, and the barrier field, obedient as ever, did the rest. Tolian watched 271 ships fold and smear across the threshold line in the space of 9 seconds, killed by the unanimous decree of their own government, and the tracking board went, all at once, to a single line of text repeated until it filled the screen. Object never present, object never present, object never present. The quiet margin had not fired during the census. It had not needed to. It had simply existed, outside the only system the galaxy had, and let the system's strongest blow miss it and come down on the system itself. Tolian sat with the dead tracking board in front of him and understood, for the first time in his life, the true size of the thing the registry had built and never once doubted. It had taught 4,000 worlds that the list was the floor under their feet, the air in their lungs, the ground of all reality, and the humans had walked in and shown, in a single afternoon, that the list was not the floor at all. It was a wager. The whole galaxy had bet its existence on the belief that nothing could live outside the record, and the humans had simply declined the bet, and the moment one species declined it, the wager was exposed for what it had always been, which was a story the strong told the weak, so the weak would never test it. The registry had not ruled by power. It had ruled by a story about power, and a story holds only until one listener says, plainly and without fear, that it is not true. Tolian had spent 41 years writing inside that story. He was watching, now, the first page of the world that came after it, and he found that his hand, which had counted grain for 4 decades, was perfectly steady, because a man who has waited his whole life for one true thing to record does not tremble when it finally arrives. When the census faded, the human channel opened one more time, into a silence so complete that Tolian could hear the Almut clerk 3 desks away, weeping without sound. "We didn't kill your fleet," the calm voice said, and for the first time there was something underneath the calm, something old and tired, and not cruel at all. "You did. We just stood where you aimed. We've been telling you since the first hail. We're not on your list. Everything you've got, every wall and weapon and law, only works on things that are on your list. You built a whole galaxy that can only fight itself." Quorum 9, the supervisor, the door-sized being of perfect procedure, said nothing. There was no procedure. The thing the Hesh had spent its life believing, that the ledger was the world, that to be unlisted was to be helpless, lay in pieces on the tracking board, and out of those pieces had walked the one truth the registry had spent 9,000 years making sure no species would ever learn. You do not need to be permitted to exist. You can simply decide that you do. Tolian looked at his supervisor then, and saw something he had never seen in 41 years of working beside the Hesh. He saw a clerk with no form to fill. Quorum 9's whole being had been built on the certainty that every situation had a procedure, and every procedure had a number, and every number led, by a chain of correct steps, to a resolved file. The supervisor had reached the end of that chain. There was no next step. The final census was the last instrument, the loudest word, the thing the registry had kept in reserve for 9,000 years, against the day it might truly need it, and the humans had not merely survived it. They had made the registry fire it into its own heart. There was nothing larger to invoke. There was nothing at all. And a being who has spent its entire existence believing that the list contains every possible answer, faced suddenly with a question the list cannot hold, does not rage and does not weep. It simply stops, the way a counting machine stops when it reaches a number it was never built to hold. And Quorum 9, the door-sized being of perfect procedure, stopped, and never truly started again. And then, into that ringing silence, the human did the thing that broke Tolian Breck's heart, and saved his life at the same time, the thing that turned this from a slaughter into a warning, the thing that no one in the inner sphere had ever once offered another being. "There's a clerk on your station," the quiet margin said. "He's been keeping a record, a real one, the only honest log in this whole place. We've been reading it. Tell him to keep writing. The galaxy's going to need to know how this happened, and he's the only one who wrote down the truth." Every eye on Border Station Vale turned to Tolian Breck, chronicler, counter of things, the one being there whose private column had recorded, sentence by true sentence, the death of the only world he had ever known. He looked at his stylus. He looked at the screen, full of the words "object never present." And he understood that the humans had not come to conquer the registry. The registry could not be conquered, because the registry was not a thing you could fight. They had come to prove it was already dead, and to leave one witness who would say so. He started to write the next sentence. His hand did not shake at all. The registry did not surrender, because it had no form for surrender, and that absence of a form is what nearly ended every species inside the ledger. When the news of Border Station Vale reached the inner sphere, the 4,000 worlds did not respond as a frightened people responds. They responded as a filing system responds to an error. They looked for the rule that would make the error go away, and the deeper they looked, the worse the news became, because the humans had read every rule first, and every rule the registry reached for had already been turned into a trap. Tolian kept writing through all of it. The quiet margin had left him alive, and left the station mostly intact, and in the days that followed, his honest log became the most copied document in galactic history, smuggled world to world by clerks who had spent their whole lives believing the ledger was reality, and were now reading, in plain words, the account of a man who had watched reality decline to cooperate. They came to his channel by the millions. They asked him the same question, over and over, in 40 languages. He did not understand, at first, why they came to him. He was a chronicler. He had no rank. He could not lift a sanction, or grant a number, or open a route. But that, he slowly realized, was precisely why they trusted him. Every other voice in the registry spoke through the list, and the list had just been revealed as a thing that could be turned against you in an afternoon, and so the worlds no longer believed anything that came stamped with authority. They believed the man with no authority, the one who had sat at the lowest desk on a border station and written down what he actually saw. In a civilization where every official word had become suspect overnight, the only credible voice left was the one that had never been official at all. Tolian Breck, who had spent 41 years writing reports no one read, found that he had become, without trying, the most read being in the galaxy, and he did not want it, and he could not refuse it, because someone had to tell the truth, and he was the only one in the habit. How do we put them back on the list? Tolian told them the truth, because he was a chronicler, and the truth was his only trade. You cannot put them back on the list. They were never on it. That is the whole point. That is the weapon. He wrote it so many times that the sentence began to feel worn, like a step climbed by too many feet. The registry tried anyway. It convened the High Index, the gathering of the 40 oldest clerk lords, beings who between them had issued and revoked more numbers than there were stars in the inner sphere. The High Index met on the Pale Throne, a station 10 times the size of Vale, and it did the only thing it knew how to do at scale. It declared a new law. The law said that anything not on the list was, henceforth, automatically assigned a number against its will, so that it could then be sanctioned, tracked, denied, and erased through the normal channels. It was clever. Tolian recorded it and admitted, in his private column, that it was clever. The High Index had found the one move that might work. If the humans could be forced onto the list, they could be fought with the list, and the list was the one thing the registry had ever been good at. Tolian watched the clerk lords debate it, because the High Index, in its pride, deliberated on open channels so that all 4,000 worlds could witness the registry restoring order. He watched the oldest of them, a clerk lord called von Ordinal, who had kept the list for 2,000 years, argue against it. Von Ordinal said, in the dry, careful voice of a being who has read more than anyone alive, that they were reasoning as if the humans had not anticipated this, that the humans had anticipated everything else, that a species patient enough to study the registry from outside, for who knew how long, careful enough to feed 300 gunners a false shape of itself, would surely have read the law they were about to pass before they ever provoked it. He asked the High Index a single question: why would a being who refused a number at the cost of war suddenly want one badly enough that we should believe forcing one on it is a punishment? The High Index did not listen, because the High Index had no form for the suggestion that being on the list could be anything but safety. To the clerk lords, the list was protection itself. The idea that an enemy might want to be on the list, might be maneuvering to be placed on it, was as senseless to them as an idea can be. So they overruled von Ordinal, and they passed the law, and von Ordinal, who alone among them had understood, did the most honest thing a clerk lord did in the whole affair. The old keeper resigned its post, surrendered its own number, and walked out of the Pale Throne unlisted, because it would not put its name to the document it knew was about to hand the galaxy away. The Clerk Lords issued the human race a number. It was a long number. They assigned it with full ceremony, and they aimed the entire apparatus of the ledger at it, the sanctions and the census and the barrier fields of 4,000 worlds, all loaded and ready to fire the instant the number went live. The quiet margin returned to galactic space the same hour. It had been waiting, Tolian understood, for exactly this. It crossed into the inner sphere as openly as it had crossed the threshold line, and it broadcast on the authority-wide band so that every world heard it at once, and the calm voice carried a small, dry humor that Tolian had come to recognize as the most dangerous sound humans made. "You gave us a number," the human said. "Thank you. We accept. And since we're on your list now, we'd like to file something. We've read your laws very carefully, and there's a procedure we'd like to use. It's an old one. You'll find it in your own statutes, Section 9 of the Founding Index, never repealed, the succession of the ledger." On the Pale Throne, the High Index went very still. Tolian saw the records of their alarm bleed into the open channels. The succession of the ledger was 9,000 years old. It had been written when the registry was young, a single clause meant to ensure the list could never be left without a keeper, and it said, in language no one had read in millennia, that the holder of the highest unbroken registry authority became the keeper of the entire ledger, and that authority was measured one way and one way only, by the number of entries you had lawfully removed from the active record. This was the line. This was the line the quiet margin had lingered on, 2 hours into its first reading, on Tolian's screen. On the founding statutes no clerk alive had bothered to read in full. The humans had not been searching for a weapon when they read those old words. They had found the weapon, and then spent weeks building a war around it, a war whose only purpose was to satisfy, lawfully and beyond dispute, the single ancient condition that handed an empire to whoever erased the most of it. Every cutter the quiet margin had unlisted at Vale had not merely been a defense. It had been an entry in a ledger of its own, a count, a qualification, a careful patient accumulation of the exact thing Section 9 measured. The humans had just unlisted 312 tribute wardens, and, through the registry's own final census, 271 more, in a single engagement, lawfully, on the record, with not one rule broken. No clerk lord in 9,000 years had removed a fraction of that many entries in a lifetime. The moment the registry placed humanity on the list, humanity became, by the registry's own founding law, the single highest registry authority in existence. "By your statute, not ours," the quiet margin said gently. "We're now the keeper of the ledger. All of it. Every world, every number, every soul you ever filed. You spent 9,000 years teaching the galaxy that the list is the only thing that's real. We just inherited the list. So let's talk about what real means." Tolian Breck set down his stylus for the first time in days, because his hands had finally understood what his mind had been circling, and he needed both of them flat on the desk to stay steady. The humans had not beaten the registry with the quiet margin. The ship was never the weapon. The ship was the demonstration. They had read the registry's deepest law before they ever fired a shot, found the one door that opened only for the unlisted, walked through it, gotten themselves placed on the list at the precise moment that doing so handed them the keys to everything, and turned an empire of 9,000 years into their lawful inheritance, with a single ship, without breaking a rule, and the only blood spilled had been the registry's own, by the registry's own hand, by the registry's own decree. It was the most complete victory Tolian had ever recorded. He should have felt nothing but awe. He almost did. He thought, in that moment, of Von Ordinal, the one clerk lord who had seen it coming, walking out of the Pale Throne with no number, into a galaxy that no longer had any meaning for the numberless, except the one the humans had just demonstrated. He thought of how strange it was that the only being in the high index wise enough to understand the trap had been the only one to escape the worst of it, because by giving up its own number before the law passed, Von Ordinal had stepped, knowingly, into the same condition the humans occupied, outside the list, beyond its reach, free. Tolian wondered, and never learned, whether the old keeper had understood that too, whether the resignation had been despair, or whether it had been the first being in the inner sphere to choose what the humans had chosen, which was to simply stop asking permission to exist. He hoped it was the second. He wrote down both, because a chronicler does not decide and let the truth sit unfinished, the way the truth so often does. But Tolian was a chronicler, and a chronicler's curse is that he sees the whole page, not just the line that is bright. And as the high index began, in dawning horror, to comprehend that it now answered to a species it had declared a typo 9 days earlier, Tolian looked at what the humans had actually inherited and felt the awe curdle into something heavier. The humans now held the ledger, the whole ledger, 4,000 worlds whose air, whose medicine, whose seed, whose water, whose every breath had been routed for 9,000 years through a list that now belonged to Earth. The registry had built a galaxy that could not feed itself without permission, that could not breathe without a number, that had traded its own survival for 9 millennia of peace, and the humans had not destroyed that cage. They had simply taken the only key. And Tolian understood, writing it slowly, that this was the price. The humans had won so totally, so lawfully, so perfectly, that there was now no power left in the galaxy except them. The registry was finished. Its weapon was theirs. Its worlds depended on a keeper who, 9 days ago, the galaxy had tried to erase. The humans had not conquered anyone. They had inherited everyone, all at once, the whole dependent, helpless weight of 4,000 worlds, and Tolian did not yet know what they would do with it, and neither, he realized, did they. He thought about that for a long time, alone at his desk on a station full of clerks who had stopped pretending to work, on a station where the supervisor sat motionless and unspeaking at the center of the floor. He thought about how every conqueror he had ever recorded had wanted the thing it took. The Hesh had wanted the list. The old rivals, before the registry listed them out of history, had wanted territory, or tribute, or the simple pleasure of being feared. Wanting was the engine of every conquest in the catalog. And the humans, alone in 9,000 years of records, had taken the greatest prize the galaxy had ever held, while plainly, visibly, not wanting it at all. He did not have a category for a victor who did not want the spoils. The ledger did not have one either. It was the second thing the humans had done that the registry could not file, and Tolian was beginning to suspect there would be a third, and a fourth, and that he would spend whatever remained of his life filing the unfileable, and that this was, somehow, the work he had been kept alive to do. The quiet Margin's voice came one last time over the open band, and the dry humor was gone, and what was left underneath was the oldest sound Tolian had ever heard from any species. It was the sound of someone who has just been handed something too heavy and has not yet decided whether they are strong enough to carry it. "We didn't want the list," the human said quietly. "We wanted you to stop using it on people, but you wouldn't put it down, so now it's ours, and 4,000 worlds can't drink water without us. That wasn't the win we came for. That's just the one you left us." Tolian Breck picked up his stylus and wrote, in the private column, the sentence that the whole galaxy would one day read, and not understand until it was far too old to change. "They came to free us from the list. They won so completely that now we belong to them instead, and they did not want us, and there is no one left to give us back to." In the end, the humans did the one thing the registry had no form for, and it cost them everything they had come to keep. For 90 days the galaxy held its breath. The quiet Margin sat above the pale throne, the lawful keeper of the ledger, and did nothing. It issued no sanctions. It erased no worlds. It did not feed itself on the helplessness of 4,000 planets, the way every keeper before it had. The high index waited for the revenge it knew it had earned, the slow alphabetical starvation it had inflicted on 100 rebel worlds across 9,000 years. And the revenge did not come, and the not coming was somehow more frightening than the punishment would have been, because a being that holds your throat and does not squeeze is a being you cannot predict. Tolian Breck waited with them, and he kept writing, and the humans kept reading what he wrote, and through that thin thread he came to understand what the quiet Margin was actually doing in those 90 silent days. It was studying, the same patient, total, gentle study he had watched at the threshold line on the first shift. The humans had inherited a machine that ran 4,000 worlds, a machine no one alive understood in full, a machine that decided who breathed, and before they touched a single setting, they were reading the entire thing, top to bottom, the way you read a list. the way Tolian read the catalog for pleasure, so that when they acted, they would not break the thing the worlds depended on to live. It was the most responsible thing Tolian had ever seen a victor do. It was also, he came to realize, the trap closing on the humans themselves. In those 90 days, Tolian spoke with one of them. He had not expected to. He was a chronicler on a broken station, and they were the new keepers of the galaxy, and he assumed his only contact with them would be the reading of his log. But on the 40th day, a channel opened to his console alone, not the authority-wide band, just a quiet line to one old clerk at the lowest desk on Border Station Vale, and the calm voice asked him whether the record was complete, and whether he had everything he needed, and whether he wished to add anything to it that he had been afraid to write. Tolian asked the only question he had carried since the first shift. He asked why they had come, not how. The how he had recorded in full, the why he did not understand, because nothing in the catalog explained why a species that wanted nothing the registry held would cross 9,000 years of law to take a thing it did not want. The human was quiet for a while. Then it told him that a long time ago, before any of this, a registry trade fleet had found the edge of human space and offered them a number, and that the humans had read the terms of the number before they signed, the way they read everything, and had seen in the small print what the number cost, which was the slow forgetting of how to live without it, and the humans had declined, and the fleet had gone away. And the humans had spent the centuries since reading the registry from the dark, learning every line of it, because they had understood, from the small print of a single offered contract, that a power which made existence conditional on permission would one day come for everyone who had ever said no, and that the only way to be safe from such a power was not to hide from it, but to take it apart. They had not come for conquest. They had come because they had read the contract, all of it, to the end, and had decided they could not let it stand. Tolian wrote it down. It was the truest thing anyone ever told him, and the human had told it to a clerk at the lowest desk in the galaxy, because the humans always spoke to the witness, and never to the throne. Every conqueror in the records Tolian had ever read had done the opposite. They had seized a thing and used it before they understood it, because the using was the point, because power, impatient for power, does not pause to learn the shape of what it has taken. The registry itself, in its youth, had done exactly that, snatching the list from the species that built it and turning it into a leash within a generation. That was the natural way of conquest. Take, then comprehend, and let the gap between the two be paid for by whoever happens to be standing in it. The humans did not do this. The humans, holding absolute power over 4,000 worlds, holding the breath of 100 billion beings in their hands, did nothing for 90 days but read, because they refused to act on the lives of strangers until they understood every consequence of acting. Tolian, watching, came to see that this was not weakness, and not even mercy exactly. It was the same thing that had made them unbeatable in the first place. They would not move until they had read the whole list. It was the single human trait the registry had never been able to measure, because it did not appear in any catalog, and it was the trait that had won them everything, and was, Tolian slowly understood, about to cost them everything too. Because the more the quiet margin learned about the ledger, the clearer it became that the ledger could not simply be switched off. 4,000 worlds had spent 9,000 years forgetting how to feed themselves. Their farms were registered, their water was registered, their air recyclers would not run without a valid number, pinging a central index every cycle. If the humans put the list down, as they had come to make the registry do, the worlds would not become free. They would suffocate, all of them in the dark, because freedom from the list was now indistinguishable from death by it. The humans had come to break a cage, and found 100 billion people living inside the cage with no lungs of their own. Tolian had not understood, until the humans showed him, how complete the dependency had become. He had lived inside it his whole life, and never seen it, the way you do not see the air. The registry had not merely required worlds to register their food and water. Over 9,000 years it had quietly arranged that the knowledge of how to make food and water without registration was itself lost, unfiled, allowed to die out of every culture under its rule, because a people who remember how to feed themselves are a people who might one day decide they do not need a number. The list had not only chained the galaxy, it had erased the memory of any life before the chain. That was the deepest cruelty of the registry, and it was so deep that no one had ever noticed it was cruel, and it meant that the humans could not simply free the worlds. There was nothing to free them into. The fields had forgotten how to be fields. The people had forgotten how to be people who were not on a list. The humans had walked into the inner sphere expecting to find prisoners, and had found, instead, something far worse and far harder to save. They had found a galaxy that had been taught, generation by generation, to need its own cage, and a cage that had eaten the key to itself so thoroughly that even its keepers no longer knew the shape of the lock. On the 91st day, the quiet margin opened the authority-wide band one last time, and Tolian set down everything else and wrote only this, because he understood it was the last entry that mattered. "We've read the whole ledger now," the human said, and the voice was steady and tired and certain. "We know what happens if we put it down. You'd die, all of you. Not because we did anything, because of what you let yourselves become. We came here to take the list out of anyone's hands. We can't. There's no hands to give it to that aren't already starving." The high index said nothing. 4,000 worlds said nothing. Tolian's stylus moved. "So here's what we're going to do. And we want it on the honest record. The clerk's record, not yours," the human said. "We're going to keep the list. Not because we want it, because someone has to hold it while you learn to breathe on your own again, and that's going to take longer than any of us will live. We're going to teach you to grow your own food, off the index, pump your own water, off the index, make your own air, off the index, world by world, generation by generation. And every world that learns, we take off the list, for good, and we never put it back. Not as punishment, as graduation. The list gets shorter every year until there's nothing left on it, and then we burn it, and then we leave." Tolian Breck stopped writing. He understood, finally and completely, the shape of the human victory, and it was not the shape anyone in the galaxy had imagined. The humans had won everything, and kept nothing. They had inherited an empire, and sentenced themselves to dismantle it by hand, one world at a time, across centuries, a labor with no glory in it, and no end any of them would live to see. They had come for a single ship's worth of justice, and walked away the unwilling wardens of 100 billion strangers, bound to the ledger now more tightly than any clerk lord had ever been, because the keeper who intends to free everyone can never set the list down until the last name is off it. It was a victory. It was total. The registry was finished, its weapon defanged forever, its cruelty ended. And it had cost the humans the very thing they had crossed the threshold line to protect. Their freedom. They would not go home. Not for generations. They had traded their liberty for the slow liberation of a galaxy that had tried to erase them 9 days after they arrived. Tolian wrote the cost down plainly, because that was his trade, and because the humans had asked him to. They had won, and the winning had bound them, and that was the truth, and the truth was the only monument they would accept. The clerk lords of the high index, beings of perfect procedure, could not comprehend it. A keeper who weakened his own list on purpose. A power that spent itself to make itself unnecessary. There was no form for it. There would never be a form for it. And that, Tolian understood, was the deepest thing the humans had taught the galaxy. Deeper than the quiet margin's untouchable engines. Deeper than the trick of the unlisted master key. The registry had believed that the only thing real was what could be put on a list. The humans had proved that the realest thing of all was the choice to take a name off it and ask for nothing back. Some of the clerk lords could not survive the comprehension. Tolian recorded that too, because it was true, and because the truth was the only monument the humans would accept. 3 of the 40 simply stopped, the way Quorum 9 had stopped, their whole architecture of belief collapsing inward when the world turned out to be larger than the list. But others, the younger ones, the ones whose certainty had not yet hardened all the way through, began, in the 91st day and the days after it, to do a thing the registry had no form for either. They began to learn. They came to the humans, quietly, with questions, the way the worlds had come to Tolian, and they asked how a field grows without a number, and how water moves without permission, and the humans answered them, patiently, completely, the way they answered everything, and the answers were not punishments, and were not mercies, but simply the truth, handed over freely, to anyone who would take it. The quiet margin began its work the next morning. It did not start with a great world or a proud one. It started with the smallest, poorest planet on the index, a place called Renu's Drift. 3 million farmers who had not grown an unregistered grain in 9,000 years. A human shuttle went down to the surface, with seed that needed no number, and the knowledge of how to plant it. And the work began. The long, quiet work. The work that would outlast the humans who started it. Tolian recorded the first planting, because the humans asked him to, and because he understood that it was the true ending of the story he had begun on his console at Border Station Vale. The farmers of Renu's Drift did not cheer. They were afraid. For 9,000 years, it had been a crime against the world itself to put a seed in the ground that did not have a number, and the fear of that crime was older than any of them, bred into them across 300 generations, and the first farmer to take the unnumbered seed from the human hand did so with shaking fingers, the way you take a thing you have been told all your life will kill you. The human did not rush her. The human waited, patient as the gray ship in the dark, until she chose to close her hand. That was the whole of the human method, Tolian saw. They would not free anyone who did not choose to be free. They would only wait, and teach, and wait, for as long as it took, which was forever, which was the cost. The seed went into the ground of Renu's Drift, and it was the first free thing planted in the galaxy in 9,000 years, and it was small, and no one of importance saw it, and Tolian Breck wrote it down, and that was enough, because the humans had taught him that the realest things are almost always small, almost always unseen, and never once on anyone's list. Tolian Breck asked to go with them. He was a chronicler. He wanted to record the first world coming off the list, and the second, and the 100th, however many he lived to see. The humans said yes. Of course they said yes. He was the only one who had ever written down the truth, and they had told him on the first shift to keep writing, and he intended to, all the way to the end of the list, however far past his own life that end might lie. Before he left, he went to find Sepha, the Almut clerk 3 desks over, the one who had understood second. He found her packing a small case at her station, her translucent skin clear and steady now, the cold water color gone. She was taking her child off the station, she told him. The humans had offered passage to Renu's Drift for anyone who wanted to learn the old work, the planting, the pumping, the making of air by hand, and she had volunteered before the offer was finished. She did not want her child to grow up needing a number to breathe. Tolian understood, then, that the humans were not only freeing the worlds. They were finding, on every station and every planet, the few who had understood, the ones who had felt the cold water fear in the first hour, and they were quietly turning them into teachers, so that when the humans were gone, the work would go on without them. He told Sepha he would record her field. She told him she would hold him to it. They had worked beside each other for 41 years, and were only now, at the end of the world, becoming friends. And that too went into the private column, because it was true, and because it was the kind of true thing that no list had ever had a place for. He took one last reading of Border Station Vale before he left, the place where it had all begun, the desk where he had logged the first human ship in galactic history as a typo. He thought about Quorum 9, who had declared the humans non-existent and handed them the keys to everything, and who had died of nothing more than the discovery that the world was larger than the ledger. He thought about the tracking board full of the words, "Object never present." He thought about how a single ship had arrived unannounced, without a number, asking for nothing, and how the galaxy had seen its mistake far too late, and how the mistake had not been letting the humans in. The mistake had been believing that anything could keep them out. Tolian Breck opened his honest log one final time aboard the human shuttle as it carried him toward the first free world in 9,000 years, and he wrote the last sentence of the only true account of how the galaxy ended and began again. And he wrote it the way the humans would have wanted, plainly, without glory, with the cost set down beside the win where the truth belonged. A human ship arrived unannounced, and we saw our mistake too late, and the mercy of it is that they won. The grief of it is that the winning bound them to us, and they took it up anyway, and they are out there still, taking the galaxy off the list one name at a time, and they will not be free until we are, and they knew that, and they crossed the line anyway. He set down the stylus. Outside the shuttle window, Renu's Drift turned slowly in the dark. 3 million farmers about to plant the first unnumbered seed in 9,000 years. and somewhere above it, the gray ship that had never asked permission watched over them, patient, untouchable, and not free. And Tolian Breck, chronicler, counter of things, understood at last that he had spent his whole life waiting to record the one event worth recording, and that he would spend the rest of it doing exactly that, and that there was no better way for any life to be spent. He did not know how the story ended. No one did. The list was 4,000 worlds long, and the humans were taking it apart one name at a time, and the end of it lay far past the lives of everyone now living, far past Tolian's own life, far past the lives of the humans aboard the gray ship, who had given up their freedom to begin a work they would never see finished. That was the shape of it. A victory so total that it became a debt the winners chose to pay in full, a payment measured not in tribute, but in centuries of patient teaching, world by world, seed by seed, until the last name came off the list, and the gray ship finally turned for home. The galaxy had built a list, and called it the world. The humans had inherited the list, and would spend themselves burning it, and would ask for nothing in return but a witness. Tolian Breck was the witness. He would not let them down.